The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky. Chapter 7. Family, Youth, and Culture. Number 3. Nationality and Culture. The policy of Bolshevism on the national question, having ensured the victory of the October Revolution, also helped the Soviet Union to hold out afterward, notwithstanding inner centrifugal forces and a hostile environment. The bureaucratic degeneration of the state has rested like a millstone upon the national policy. It was upon the national question that Lenin intended to give his first battle to the bureaucracy, and especially to Stalin, at the 12th Congress of the party in the spring of 1923. But before the Congress met, Lenin had gone from the ranks. The documents which he then prepared remain even now suppressed by the censor. The cultural demands of the nations aroused by the revolution require the widest possible autonomy. At the same time, industry can successfully develop only by subjecting all parts of the Union to a general, centralized plan. But economy and culture are not separated by impermeable partitions. The tendencies of cultural autonomy and economic centralism come naturally from time to time into conflict. The contradiction between them is, however, far from irreconcilable. Although there can be no once-and-for-all prepared formula to resolve the problem, there still is the resilient will of the interested masses themselves. Only their actual participation in the administration of their own destinies can at each new stage draw the necessary lines between the legitimate demands of economic centralism and the living gravitations of national culture. The trouble is, however, that the will of the population of the Soviet Union in all its national divisions is now wholly replaced by the will of a bureaucracy which approaches both economy and culture from the point of view of convenience of administration and the specific interests of the ruling stratum. It is true that in the sphere of national policy, as in the sphere of economy, the Soviet bureaucracy still continues to carry out a certain part of the progressive work, although with immoderate overhead expenses. This is especially true of the backward nationalities of the Union, which must of necessity pass through a more or less prolonged period of borrowing, imitation, and assimilation of what exists. The bureaucracy is laying down a bridge for them to the elementary benefits of bourgeois, and in part, even pre-bourgeois culture. In relation to many spheres and peoples, the Soviet power is to a considerable extent carrying out the historic work fulfilled by Peter I and his colleagues in relation to the old Muscovy, only on a larger scale and at a swifter tempo. In the schools of the Union, lessons are taught at present in no less than 80 languages. For a majority of them, it was necessary to compose new alphabets or to replace the extremely aristocratic Asiatic alphabets with the more democratic Latin. Newspapers are published in the same number of languages, papers which, for the first time, acquaint the peasants and nomad shepherds with the elementary ideas of human culture. Within the far-flung boundaries of the Tsar's empire, a native industry is arising. The old semi-clan culture is being destroyed by the tractor. Together with literacy, scientific agriculture, and medicine are coming into existence. It would be difficult to overestimate the significance of this work of raising up new human strata. Marx was right when he said that revolution is the locomotive of history. But the most powerful locomotive cannot perform miracles. It cannot change the laws of space, and can only accelerate movement. The very necessity of acquainting tens of millions of grown-up people with the alphabet and the newspaper, or with the simple laws of hygiene, shows what a long road must be traveled before you can really pose the question of a new socialist culture. The press informs us, for example, that in Western Siberia, the oirots, who formerly did not know what a bath means, have now, in many villages, baths to which they sometimes travel 30 kilometers to wash themselves. This extreme example, although taken at the lowest level of culture, nevertheless truthfully suggests the heights of many other achievements, and that not only in the backward regions. When the head of a government, in order to illustrate the growth of culture, refers to the fact that in the collective farms, a demand has arisen for iron bedsteads, wall clocks, knit underwear, sweaters, bicycles, etc. This only means that the well-off upper circles of the Soviet villages are beginning to use those articles of manufacture which were long ago in common use among the peasant masses of the West. From day to day, in speeches and in the press, lessons are pronounced on the theme of cultured socialist trade. In the essence, it is a question of giving a clean, attractive look to the government stores, supplying them with the necessary technical implements and a sufficient assortment of goods, not letting the apples rot, throwing in darning cotton with stockings, and teaching the selling clerk to be polite and attentive to the customer. In other words, acquiring the commonplace methods of capitalist trade. We are still far from solving this extremely important problem, in which, however, there is not a drop of socialism. If we leave laws and institutions aside for a moment, and take the daily life of the basic mass of the population, and if we do not deliberately delude our minds, or others, we are compelled to acknowledge that in life, customs, and culture, the heritage of Tsarist and bourgeois Russia in the Soviet country vastly prevails over the embryonic growth of socialism. Most convincing on this subject is the population itself, which, at the least, rise of the standard of living throws itself avidly upon the ready models of the West. The young Soviet clerks, and often the workers too, try both in dress and manner to imitate American engineers and technicians with whom they happen to come into contact in the factories. The industrial and clerical working girls devour with their eyes the foreign lady tourist in order to capture her modes and manners. The lucky girl who succeeds in this becomes an object of wholesale imitation. Instead of the old bangs, the better paid working girl acquires a permanent wave. The youth are eagerly joining Western dancing circles. In a certain sense, all this means progress. But what chiefly expresses itself here is not the superiority of socialism over capitalism, but the prevailing of petty bourgeois culture over patriarchal life, the city over the village, the center over the backwoods, the West over the East. The privileged Soviet stratum does its borrowing meanwhile in the higher capitalistic spheres. And in this field, the pacemakers are the diplomats, directors of trusts, engineers, who have to make frequent trips to Europe and America. Soviet satire is silent on this question, for it is simply forbidden to touch the upper 10,000. However, we cannot but remark with sorrow that the loftiest emissaries of the Soviet Union have been unable to reveal in the face of capitalist civilization either a style of their own or any independent traits whatever. They have not found sufficient inner stability to enable them to scorn external shine and observe the necessary aloofness. Their chief ambition, ordinarily, is to differ as little as possible from the most finished snobs of the bourgeoisie. In a word, they feel and conduct themselves in a majority of cases not as the representatives of a new world, but as ordinary parvenu. To say that the Soviet Union is now performing that cultural work which the advanced countries long ago performed on the basis of capitalism would be, however, only half the truth. The new social forms are by no means irrelevant. They not only give to a backward country the possibility of gaining the level of the most advanced, but they permit it to achieve this task in a much shorter space of time than was needed formerly in the West. The explanation of this acceleration of tempo is simple. The bourgeois pioneers had to invent their technique and learn to apply it in the spheres both of economy and culture. The Soviet Union takes it ready-made in its latest forms and, thanks to the socialized means of production, applies the borrowings not partially and by degrees, but at once and on a gigantic scale. Military authorities have more than once celebrated the role of the army as a carrier of culture, especially in relation to the peasantry. Without deceiving ourselves as to the specific kind of culture which bourgeois militarism inculcates, we cannot deny that many progressive customs have been instilled in the popular masses through the army. Not for nothing have former soldiers and under-officers in revolutionary and especially peasant movements usually stood at the head of the insurrectionists. The Soviet regime has an opportunity to influence the daily life of the people, not only through the army, but also through the whole state apparatus, and interwoven with it the apparatus of the party, the communist youth, and the trade unions. an appropriation of ready-made models of technique, hygiene, art, sport, in an infinitely shorter time than was demanded for their development in their homeland, is guaranteed by the state forms of property, the political dictatorship, and the planned methods of administration. If the October Revolution had given nothing but this accelerated forward movement, it would be historically justified. For the declining bourgeois regime has proved incapable during the last quarter century of seriously moving forward any one of the backward countries in any part of the earth. However, the Russian proletariat achieved the revolution in the name of much more far-reaching tasks. No matter how suppressed it is politically at present, in its better parts, it has not renounced the communist program, nor the mighty hope bound up with it. The bureaucracy is compelled to accommodate itself to the proletariat, partly in the very direction of its policy, but chiefly in the interpretation of it. Hence, every step forward in the sphere either of economy or culture, regardless of its actual historic content or its real significance in the life of the masses, is proclaimed as a hitherto unseen and unheard of conquest of socialist culture. There is not a doubt that to make toilet soap and a toothbrush the possession of millions, who up to yesterday never heard of the simplest requirements of neatness, is a very great cultural work. But neither soap nor a brush, nor even the perfumes which our women are demanding, quite constitute a socialist culture, especially in conditions where these pitiable attributes of civilization are accessible only to some 15% of the population. The making over of men, of which they talk so much in the Soviet press, is truly in full swing. But to what degree is this a socialist making over? The Russian people never knew in the past either a great religious reformation like the Germans, or a great bourgeois revolution like the French. Out of these two furnaces, if we leave aside the Reformation revolution of the British Islanders in the 17th century, came bourgeois individuality, a very important step in the development of human personality in general. The Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917 necessarily meant the first awakening of individuality in the masses, its crystallization out of the primitive medium. That is to say, they fulfilled, in abridged form and accelerated tempo, the educational work of the bourgeois reformations and revolutions of the West. Long before this work was finished, however, even in the rough, the Russian Revolution, which had broken out in the twilight of capitalism, was compelled, by the course of the class struggle, to leap over to the road of socialism. The contradictions in the sphere of Soviet culture only reflect and refract the economic and social contradictions which grew out of this leap. The awakenings of personality under these circumstances necessarily assumes a more or less petty bourgeois character, not only in economics, but also in family life and lyric poetry. The bureaucracy itself has become the carrier of the most extreme and sometimes unbridled bourgeois individualism. Permitting and encouraging the development of economic individualism, piecework, private land allotments, premiums, decorations, it at the same time ruthlessly suppresses the progressive side of individualism in the realm of spiritual culture, critical views, the development of one's own opinion, the cultivation of personal dignity. The more considerable the level of development of a given national group, or the higher the sphere of its cultural creation, or again, the more closely it grapples with the problems of society and personality, the more heavy and intolerable becomes the pressure of the bureaucracy. There can in reality be no talk of uniqueness of national culture when one and the same conductor's baton, or rather one and the same police club, undertakes to regulate all the intellectual activities of all the peoples of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian, White Russian, Georgian, or Turk newspapers and books are only translations of the bureaucratic imperative into the language of the corresponding nationality. Under the name of models of popular creativeness, the Moscow press daily publishes in Russian translation odes by the prize poets of the different nationalities in honor of the leaders. Miserable verses in reality which differ only in the degree of their servility and want of talent. The great Russian culture, which has suffered from the regime of the guardhouse no less than the others, lives chiefly at the expense of the older generation formed before the revolution. The youth are suppressed as though with an iron plank. It is a question, therefore, not of the oppression of one nationality over another in the proper sense of the word, but of oppression by the centralized police apparatus over the cultural development of all the nations, starting with the Great Russian. We cannot, however, ignore the fact that 90% of the publications of the Soviet Union are printed in the Russian language. If this percentage is, to be sure, in flagrant contradiction with the relative number of the Great Russian population, still it perhaps the better corresponds to the general influence of Russian culture, both in its independent weight and its role as mediator between the backward peoples of the country and the West. But, with all that, does not the excessively high percentage of Great Russians in the publishing houses, and not only there, of course, mean an actual autocratic privilege of the Great Russians at the expense of the other nationalities of the Union? It is quite possible. To this vastly important question, it is impossible to answer as categorically as one would wish, for in life it is decided not so much by collaboration, rivalry, and mutual fertilizations of culture, as by the ultimate arbitrarement of the bureaucracy. And since the Kremlin is the residence of the authorities, and the outlying territories are compelled to keep step with the center, bureaucratism inevitably takes the color of an autocratic crucifixion, leaving to the other nationalities the sole indubitable cultural right of celebrating the arbiter in their own language. Unnumbered section. The official doctrine of culture changes in dependence upon economic zigzags and administrative expediencies. But with all its changes, it retains one trait, that of being absolutely categorical. Simultaneously with the theory of socialism in one country, the previously frowned-on theory of proletarian culture received official recognition. The opponents of this theory pointed out that the regime of proletarian dictatorship has a strictly transitional character, that in distinction from the bourgeoisie, the proletariat does not intend to dominate throughout a series of historical epochs, and that the task of the present generation of the new ruling class reduces itself primarily to an assimilation of all that is valuable in bourgeois culture, that the longer the proletariat remains a proletariat, that is, bears the traces of its former oppression, the less is it capable of rising above the historic heritage of the past, and that the possibilities of new creation will really open themselves only to the extent that the proletariat dissolves itself in a socialist society. All this means, in other words, that the bourgeois culture should be replaced by a socialist, not a proletarian culture. In a polemic against the theory of a proletarian art, produced by laboratory methods, the author of these lines wrote, "Culture feeds upon the juices of industry, and a material excess is necessary in order that culture should grow, refine, and complicate itself. Even the most successful solution of elementary economic problems would far from signify as yet a complete victory of the new historic principle of socialism. Only a forward movement of scientific thought on an all-national basis and the development of a new art would mean that the historic kernel had produced a blossom as well as a stalk. In this sense, the development of art is the highest test of the viability and significance of every epoch." This point of view, which had prevailed up to that moment, was in an official declaration suddenly proclaimed to be capitulatory, and dictated by a disbelief in the creative powers of the proletariat. There opened the period of Stalin and Bukharin, the latter of whom had long before appeared as an evangel of proletarian culture, and the former never given a thought to these questions. They both considered, in any case, that the movement towards socialism would develop with a tortoise stride, and that the proletariat would have at its disposal decades for the creation of its own culture. As to the character of this culture, the ideas of these theoreticians were as vague as they were uninspiring. The stormy years of the first 5-year plan upset the tortoise perspective. In 1931, on the eve of a dreadful famine, the country had already entered into socialism. Thus, before the officially patronized writers, artists, and painters had managed to create a proletarian culture, or even the first significant models of it, the government announced that the proletariat had dissolved in the classless society. It remained for the artists to reconcile themselves with the fact that the proletariat did not possess the most necessary condition for the creation of a proletarian culture: time. Yesterday's conceptions were immediately abandoned to oblivion. Socialist culture was placed instantly upon the order of the day. We have already in part become acquainted with its content. Spiritual creativeness demands freedom. The very purpose of communism is to subject nature to technique, and technique to plan, and compel the raw material to give unstintingly everything to man that he needs. Far more than that, its highest goal is to free finally and once and for all the creative forces of mankind from all pressure, limitation, and humiliating dependence. Personal relations, science, and art will not know any externally imposed plan, nor even any shadow of compulsion. To what degree spiritual creativeness shall be individual or collective will depend entirely upon its creators. A transitional regime is a different thing. The dictatorship reflects the past barbarism and not the future culture. It necessarily lays down severe limitations upon all forms of activity, including spiritual creation. The program of the revolution, from its very beginning, regarded these limitations as a temporary evil and assumed the obligation, in proportion as the new regime was consolidated, to remove one after the other all restrictions upon freedom. In any case, and in the hottest years of the Civil War, it was clear to the leaders of the revolution that the government could, guided by political considerations, place limitations upon creative freedom, but in no case pretend to be the role of commander in the sphere of science, literature, and art. Although he had rather conservative personal tastes in art, Lenin remained politically extremely cautious in artistic questions, eagerly confessing his incompetence. The patronizing of all kinds of modernism by Lunacharsky, the People's Commissar of Art and Education, was often embarrassing to Lenin. But he confined himself to ironical remarks in private conversations and remained remote from the idea of converting his literary tastes into law. In 1924, on the threshold of the new period, the author of this book thus formulated the relation of the state to the various artistic groups and tendencies, while holding over them all the categorical criterion for the revolution or against the revolution, to give them complete freedom in the sphere of artistic self-determination. While the dictatorship had a seething mass basis and a prospect of world revolution, it had no fear of experiments, searchings, the struggle of schools, for it understood that only in this way could a new cultural epoch be prepared. The popular masses were still quivering in every fiber, and were thinking aloud for the first time in 1,000 years. All the best youthful forces of art were touched to the quick. During those first years, rich in hope and daring, there were created not only the most complete models of socialist legislation, but also the best productions of revolutionary literature. To the same times belong, it is worth remarking, the creation of those excellent Soviet films which, in spite of a poverty of technical means, caught the imagination of the whole world with the freshness and vigor of their approach to reality. In the process of struggle against the party opposition, the literary schools were strangled one after the other. It was not only a question of literature either. The process of extermination took place in all ideological spheres, and it took place more decisively since it was more than half unconscious. The present ruling stratum considers itself called not only to control spiritual creation politically, but also to prescribe its road of development. The method of command without appeal extends in like measure to the concentration camps, to scientific agriculture, and to music. The central organ of the party prints anonymous directive editorials, having the character of military orders, in architecture, literature, dramatic art, the ballet, to say nothing of philosophy, natural science, and history. The bureaucracy superstitiously fears whatever does not serve it directly, as well as whatever it does not understand. When it demands some connection between natural science and production, this is on a large scale right, but when it commands that scientific investigators set themselves goals only of immediate practical importance, this threatens to seal up the most precious sources of invention, including practical discoveries, for these most often arise on unforeseen roads. Taught by bitter experience, the natural scientists, mathematicians, philologists, military theoreticians avoid all broad generalizations, out of fear lest some red professor, usually an ignorant careerist, threateningly pull up on them with some quotation dragged in by the hair from Lenin, or even from Stalin. To defend one's own thought in such circumstances, or one's scientific dignity, means in all probability to bring down repressions upon one's head. But it is infinitely worse in the sphere of social sciences. Economists, historians, even statisticians, to say nothing of journalists, are concerned above all things not to fall, even obliquely, into contradiction with the momentary zigzagging of the official course. about Soviet economy or domestic or foreign policy, one cannot write at all except after covering his rear and flanks with banalities from the speeches of the leader, and having assumed in advance the task of demonstrating that everything is going exactly as it should go, and even better. Although this 100% conformism frees one from everyday unpleasantness, it entails the heaviest of punishments, sterility. In spite of the fact that Marxism is formally a state doctrine in the Soviet Union, there has not appeared during the last 12 years one Marxian investigation in economics, sociology, history, or philosophy, which deserves attention and translation into foreign languages. The Marxian works do not transcend the limit of scholastic compilations, which say over the same old ideas, endorsed in advance, and shuffle over the same old quotations according to the demands of the current administrative conjuncture. Millions of copies are distributed through the state channels of books and brochures that are of no use to anybody, put together with the help of mucilage, flattery, and other sticky substances. Marxists who might say something valuable and independent are sitting in prison or forced into silence. And this in spite of the fact that the evolution of social forms is raising gigantic scientific problems at every step. Befouled and trampled underfoot is the one thing without which theoretical work is impossible: scrupulousness. Even the explanatory notes to the complete works of Lenin are radically worked over in every new edition from the point of view of the personal interests of the ruling staff. The names of leaders magnified, those of opponents vilified, tracts covered up. The same is true of the textbooks on the history of the party and the revolution. Facts are distorted, documents concealed or fabricated, reputations created or destroyed. A simple comparison of the successive variants of one and the same book during the last 12 years permits us to trace infallibly the process of degeneration of the thought and conscience of the ruling stratum. No less ruinous is the effect of the totalitarian regime upon artistic literature. The struggle of tendencies in schools has been replaced by interpretation of the will of the leaders. There has been created for all groups a general compulsory organization, a kind of concentration camp of artistic literature. Mediocre but right-thinking storytellers like Serafimovich or Gladkov are inaugurated as classics. Gifted writers who cannot do sufficient violence to themselves are pursued by a pack of instructors armed with shamelessness and dozens of quotations. The most eminent artists either commit suicide or find their material in the remote past or become silent. Honest and talented books appear as though accidentally, bursting out from somewhere under the counter, and have the character of artistic contraband. The life of Soviet art is a kind of martyrology. After the editorial orders in Pravda against formalism, there began an epidemic of humiliating recantations by writers, artists, stage directors, and even opera singers. One after the other, they renounced their own past sins, refraining, however, in case of further emergencies, from any clear-cut definition of the nature of this formalism. In the long run, the authorities were compelled by a new order to put an end to too copious flow of recantations. Literary estimates are transformed within a few weeks. Textbooks are made over, streets renamed, statues brought forward, as a result of a few eulogistic remarks of Stalin about the poet Mayakovsky. The impressions made by the new opera upon high-up auditors are immediately converted into a musical directive for composers. The secretary of the Communist Youth said at a conference of writers, "The suggestions of Comrade Stalin are a law for everybody." And the whole audience applauded, although some doubtless burned with shame. As though to complete the mockery of literature, Stalin, who does not know how to compose a Russian phrase correctly, is declared a classic in the matter of style. There is something deeply tragic in this Byzantinism and police rule, notwithstanding the involuntary comedy of certain of its manifestations. The official formula reads, "Culture should be socialist in content, national in form." As to the content of a socialist culture, however, only certain more or less happy guesses are possible. Nobody can grow that culture upon an inadequate economic foundation. Art is far less capable than science of anticipating the future. In any case, such prescriptions as portray the construction of the future, indicate the road to socialism, make over mankind, give little more to the creative imagination than does the price list of a hardware store or a railroad timetable. The national form of an art is identical with its universal accessibility. What is not wanted by the people, Pravda dictates to the artists, cannot have aesthetic significance. That old Narodnik formula, rejecting the task of artistically educating the masses, takes on a still more reactionary character when the right to decide what art the people want and what they don't want remains in the hands of the bureaucracy. It prints books according to its own choice. It sells them also by compulsion, offering no choice to the reader. In the last analysis, the whole affair comes down in its eyes to taking care that art assimilates its interests and finds such forms for them as will make the bureaucracy attractive to the popular masses. In vain, no literature can fulfill that task. The leaders themselves are compelled to acknowledge that neither the first nor the second 5-year plan has yet given us a new literary wave which can rise above the first wave born in October. That is very mildly said. In reality, in spite of individual exceptions, the epoch of the Thermidor will go into the history of artistic creation preeminently as an epoch of mediocrities, laureates, and toadies.